Welcome everybody again to our third session of the Social Analysis of Penality Across Boundaries workshop series 2022. It is a great pleasure to have today with us Gavin Slade from Nazarbayev University, who will present his work on unlikely downsizers, the prison service role in decarceration in Kazakhstan. As always, Gavin will make this presentation for around 30 minutes, and then we will have a space for questions and answers. So thank you very much, Gavin, for accepting this invitation. It's wonderful to have you here with us. You can share your screen, I think, already.
Okay. Okay, is that visible?
Yes, it is.
Fantastic. Okay, so I won't go into full screen. It's just I like to have that little Zoom panel so I can sort of see, even if it's black boxes. I'm not just speaking into a screen. Okay, so firstly, I just say thank you very much for inviting me to talk about Kazakhstan. So surprised that anyone's interested in what's happening in Kazakhstan, and I promise I'll try to make it interesting for a broad criminological audience, and speak to some of these issues around centres and peripheries in terms of global south, global north, and where countries like Kazakhstan maybe can fit in. So firstly, yeah, thank you. I really do appreciate it to the organisers. So I'll firstly, I just would like to say that obviously I have co-authors here, Alexei Trochev, who's also at Nazarbayev University with me, and Laura Piacentini, who's here this evening at the University of Strathclyde. Laura and I have been running a major project over the last 3 or 4 years. It feels longer, to be honest, about the culture of punishment in the former Soviet Union, with a focus on Russia and Kazakhstan. So that is funded by the ESRC, and the research that I'll present tonight is part of that. It's a collaboration between Nazarbayev University here in Kazakhstan, where I currently am, the High School of Economics in St. Petersburg, Russia, and the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, where some of you are. Okay, so basically what I'll try to argue in this presentation is that examining how the prison service was involved in a process of penal downsizing, a reduction in the prison rate in Kazakhstan, we can perhaps start to build a broader theory of how penal downsizing occurs in authoritarian regimes. So that's the takeaway, basically the big takeaway that I want to try to argue towards, is by studying these quite micro level processes of different actors in a context like Kazakhstan, we can broaden out and generalize to a broader theory around authoritarian regimes and their relationships to prison populations. I think that this will be hopefully quite relevant considering what's happening in the world, considering what is particularly going on in Russia at the moment, and I will make some reference to that in the conclusion, since the project itself was a comparison of Russia and Kazakhstan. Okay, so the outline for the presentation, I hope it's sort of clear to everybody and everybody can read the words on the PowerPoint. The big question is, why has Kazakhstan's prison rate been declining? So it's a penal puzzle, basically, that why has it reduced its prison rate so steeply, so quickly? And basically what I'll argue is I'll adopt an agonist approach to penal change. This is Phil Goodman and colleagues. So it's sort of to flip the question away from the why to the who. So who was reducing the prison rate in Kazakhstan? Who was arguing for it? What actors were involved? And then by applying that agonist approach, I'll focus in on the prison service. And what we see with the prison service in Kazakhstan is it plays a very counterintuitive role in this process of penal downsizing, since theoretically, in a lot of criminological theory, we see that prison services are theorized as status quo actors, or penal upsizing actors. In Kazakhstan, we find the prison service actually pushing for, advocating and supporting penal downsizing, which is curious, counterintuitive, and a puzzle which I hope I'll be able to explain by the end of the presentation. In particular, I'm going to try to focus on a sort of theory of performativity that's occurring in authoritarian regimes being very, very susceptible to reputational damage, being very worried about their reputations, and how prison rates can be linked to state performance, especially in terms of rankings of governments, rankings of states. So here thinking particularly about the World Prison Brief, which we'll see the Kazakhstani government was very interested in and quite obsessed with for long periods of time and still is. Okay, so that's the sort of outline that I'll go through. Those are the sort of 4 sections that I'll deal with. So to turn to the first section, the penal puzzle. So why has Kazakhstan reduced its prison rate so steeply? Let's move there. So assuming that people won't necessarily know very much about Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is a huge country in Central Asia. It's the 9th biggest country in the world, 19 million people. It is oil and gas rich. It's multi-ethnic state. It has large numbers of Russians, quite worryingly in some when we think about what's going on in this part of the world. And it is a former site of the Gulag. After Russia, Kazakhstan held more of the infrastructure of the Gulag than any other former Soviet republic. So this is also quite interesting in terms of thinking about risk factors in terms of punitivity. Kazakhstan had the infrastructure when it achieved independence in 1991 from the Soviet Union to have a massive penal state. So this is the map of it. This is the state flag. Kazakhstan is an authoritarian regime. It has a super presidential system. It was governed by one president from the late 80s right up until 2019. And currently the exact balance of power amongst the elites is not entirely clear, but there is emerging a new president, super president, who is sort of taken on the legacies of the last president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, whose name adorns our university. And not only our university. To show this process around the penal puzzle, if we actually look at the states of the former Soviet Union, what we actually find is that they're all reducing their prison rates, their prison populations, and they have been doing so since the year roughly 2000. So the general trend in the region is decarceration, is penal downsizing, which is curious in and of itself. So we see sort of declines during perestroika, the Gorbachev era in the late 80s, and then an uptick when independence was achieved, huge increases in crime, of course, during the 1990s. We see most states increase in prison populations during the 1990s, and then somehow in the 2000s that reverses, and we see this overall decline, with some exceptions, Turkmenistan and Georgia, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A if people are interested in those particular cases. But we see Russia declining, we see Kazakhstan, we see Ukraine, we see lots of countries, most countries engaging in penal downsizing after the year 2000. So actually, Kazakhstan turns out to be a critical case study of this process because it has been decarcerating quicker and faster than most other states. In fact, all of the states except one, which is Ukraine. And Ukraine is a very specific case because it's been at war since 2014. So there are reasons why that might be occurring. You know, it's a sort of outlier in that sense. Kazakhstan, though, reduced its prison population accordingly with the trend, but actually quicker and more intensively than other post-Soviet countries. So to show that comparatively, this is a percentage reduction in the prison rate between the year 2000 and the year 2020. Now we can see Ukraine leads that reduction with 65%. As I say, there might be exceptional reasons for Ukraine, but Kazakhstan leads the way. Then we have countries like Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Latvia, Russia, Uzbekistan. The average decline in the former Soviet Union through those years is 32%. So Kazakhstan is doubling basically the reduction of its prison rate against the average for the region. Now, I would draw your attention here to Russia and Uzbekistan because there seems to be some relationship here between authoritarianism and penal downsizing. So obviously we have Latvia here. This is European Union country which has democratized. Armenia is a sort of hybrid regime. Kyrgyzstan has moved more towards the authoritarian side in terms of its changes to its constitution. So there's a curious thing going on there. And often political scientists who watch Russia are not aware of the fact that the prison population has been declining in Russia and in countries like Belarus very significantly for the past 20 years. It doesn't fit the image of the countries that we often have, that we think that, well, they're sort of nasty authoritarian regimes, which they are, of course. And of course, these overall rates of decarceration don't tell the full story. I'm happy to break them down a little bit further as we go along. But there is, just to put a pin in it, something interesting going on in terms of the relationship between penal downsizing in the region and the political regime, which is going to be a big part of the paper as we go forward. So just to provide some visuals of what decarceration in Kazakhstan looks like, these are locations. So as part of the project, we've gone to a number of towns where penal colonies, as they're known in Kazakhstan, have been closed, and we've been doing focus groups in those towns. We're sort of interested in the social ramifications, the economic ramifications of the closing of the penal colonies. But penal colonies are being closed right across Kazakhstan, have been closed right across Kazakhstan, and these colonies mainly come from the period of the late 1950s, early 1960s. This is sort of post-Stalinist, Khrushchevian Soviet Union, where these colonies were built and they engaged in correctional labor of prisoners. And here we can see these, all of these photographs are of colonies that have closed in the last 10 to 20 years. Okay, so how exactly has decarceration occurred in Kazakhstan? Well, obviously there are certain mechanisms, legal mechanisms that explain this. I think I can go through this quite quickly. This is quite descriptive, I suppose. We can see that one of the reasons is the use of reconciliation between defendants and victims, and this has massively increased through those years as decarceration took place. So this is basically diverting people away from the court system. If you go into the court system, acquittal rates are still very, very low. It's a neo-inquisitorial criminal justice system. So you will go to prison if you go into the courts, but you have these deflection mechanisms, diversion mechanisms. The closing of criminal cases on exonerating grounds. Here we see prosecutors being rewarded for closing cases where investigators, police investigators, have been doing poor work. And we see, again, massive increases in the number of criminal cases that are simply closed. And prosecutors are actually, their performance is, the metrics by which they're judged in terms of their performance changes through this period of decarceration. And closing cases based on poor work by investigators is one of the ways prosecutors are actually rewarded. The reduction in the use of pretrial detention. We see way fewer requests being sent to judges for pretrial detention. And of course, the recategorization of offences. So the expansion of administrative offences, misdemeanours, and systems of fines and community services rather than custodial sentences for particular types of offences. So these are the mechanisms. But obviously what we want to draw your attention to here is this already starts to give us a sense of the actors involved in the decarceration process. So straight away, if you're paying attention to who is actually decarcerating here, well, prosecutors are important, right? Prosecutors are coming out as a particularly important constituency. And this is where we basically want to move towards, which is what's going on in terms of the institutional balance, the institutional conflict that might be going on over how we punish people in Kazakhstan today. So this brings us to the agonist approach, which is to ask that question of who is reducing the prison rate in Kazakhstan so steeply, which actors exactly. So this agonist approach, I'll come to in a minute. The reason why we felt that this type of approach is really necessary to understand what's going on in Kazakhstan is because the macro level approach, looking at political economic factors, for example, doesn't fully or wouldn't be very helpful in explaining. In fact, it goes against what we would expect if we just take on political economic theory for why Kazakhstan will be reducing its prison rate. So if we look at macro risk factors, for example, well, Kazakhstan actually exhibits all of the types of risk factors we associate with increases in prison populations. So it's a neoliberal autocracy. It has incredibly high levels of inequality, insecure employment, low levels of social protection, emasculated trade unions. A lot of the GDP is generated in the private sector. It's dependent on foreign direct investment, and it's dependent on natural resource exploitation. So these types of factors, traditionally in the literature are suggested to be risk factors in terms of the marginalization of certain groups that then are picked up in the criminal justice system. In terms of the political system, as I've already mentioned, this is an authoritarian regime. There's a lack of political pluralism, and it's a super presidential system. What does that suggest? Well, the research that's out there suggests that authoritarian regimes actually have a tendency to incarcerate more rather than less. They're more punitive. Their systems, procedural systems, are less transparent and less open to scrutiny, and so on. If we look at public opinion, well, this is a difficult one because public opinion isn't that well studied in Kazakhstan, but we do have some data on this, indeed our own data, where we conducted surveys in Russia and Kazakhstan, and the measures that we have for punitivity in our survey suggest that the Kazakhstani population is actually relatively punitive in global terms and has a very special relationship with the use of prison, i.e. Kazakhs want prison, just like Russians in our surveys. So public opinion also doesn't seem to be something that we would suggest would be a factor here. In fact, it seems to be a risk factor in terms of increasing prison populations. And then we come to historical legacies. Now, again, it seems to me that Kazakhstan inherited this huge penal infrastructure. There was a tight connection between the prison colonies and economic production and the economic performance of the republic. So from that perspective as well, all of the infrastructure is there to have a high prison population rather than a low prison population, as well as a culture, of course, of high prison rates where it's sort of accepted and understood that that's how we punish, we incarcerate. So there's all of these risk factors would suggest high prison rates rather than low prison rates. So this is why it seemed to us to make more sense to try to move down a level of analysis and try to get to actually who the actors were, why, despite these risk factors, in fact, Kazakhstan will be reducing its prison population. So the agonist approach, Phil Goodman and colleagues, the idea is that there's the macro level approach often identifies pendulum swings. It identifies moments where prison populations seem to turn, where they seem to suddenly increase or suddenly decrease. And they're blind, those processes are blind to incremental change that might be occurring. We won't necessarily pick them up if we're just focusing on the macro level. So their claim here is that penal change is a field of contestation amongst actors with varying amounts of power set against macro level factors. So we have all sorts of potential stakeholders in this theory. We have politicians and the media, victims groups, the broader public, prisoners' rights groups, prisoners, prison officers, and so on, the private sector. Now, if we just focus for a minute on prison services in cases that have been studied, looking at their relationship to the politics of punishment in different countries, particularly the United States, finds them to be a status quo actor, an actor that lobbies to maintain prison populations because they have invested interests, similar with the private sector. So this is the work of Joshua Page, of course. So when we started to look at who the agonists were in terms of the contestation over penal policy and penal politics in Kazakhstan, we were curious about the role of the prison service, but also the role of these other actors that we could see emerging when we were studying the mechanisms, i.e. the prosecutor's office, for example. So what did we do in terms of the research? So the research, we interviewed various different elites in Russia and Kazakhstan. Now, in Kazakhstan, it was easier to do. Russia is, becoming more and more closed as we're speaking. And even a couple of years ago, when we were doing this research, it was very difficult to access elites. It was easier in Kazakhstan. We managed to conduct around 30 interviews with elite actors in the prison service, prosecutor's office, Ministry of Interior, that's the Home Office, the presidential administration, which is all powerful in a super presidential system, and also international actors that have been involved in advocating for penal change in Kazakhstan. We also did a survey, as I've already mentioned. Now, so who comes out as the downsizing actors in these interviews and when we're studying the literature and studying the processes? Well, the presidential administration comes out very clearly that there is an impulse coming from the presidential administration that the prison population is to be reduced, and this is the will of the president. And again, nobody argues with the will of the president in a super presidential system. The prosecutor's office as part of the executive, and the prison service, and international human rights bodies. Penal Reform International is very influential here in Kazakhstan. Council of Europe, Soros Foundation. So Kazakhstan is not a member of the Council of Europe, but was influenced, for example, by Russia, which is a member of the Council of Europe. Well, was a member of the Council of Europe until very recently. And actually some of the norms were diffused through Russia to Kazakhstan, which again, I can talk about more if people like to, but that's a sort of side point. So in discussing these particular downsizing agents, it seemed to us that the prison service stands out. It's curious, it's counterintuitive. Why would the prison service be one of the actors that was pushing for prison reform? I mean, against them, you have other actors like the police and the judiciary. So why the prison service? What was going on there? So again, basing ourselves off our interviews, we tried to really investigate what was going on with the prison service and what were the impulses there. So the way I'm going to discuss this element of the paper is to talk about the prison service in terms of its norms, incentives and opportunities, and the particular institutional configuration that exists in Kazakhstan that means the prison service was actually incentivized and had opportunities to support prison downsizing. Now, that's actually a sort of ironic consequence of a lack of reform in other areas, right, where the prison service was actually unreformed, and because of its lack of reform in other senses, it pushed for penal downsizing, and as I will now explain. Okay, so unlikely downsizers. So firstly, in terms of norms, this very much follows the agonist approach. So what we find in the interviews is that even way before the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1980s, there was a lot of talk around what they called at the time humanization of the penal system. This is particularly under Gorbachev. This is the perestroika period. There was experimentation at that particular time about how we reorganize our prisons to make them more humane and so on. And so basically the idea is that there is actually a long durée going on here in terms of socialization around certain norms about the prison population being too large. And that only accelerates when the Soviet Union collapses and prison elites are able to go and visit countries abroad, particularly Poland. Poland comes out as particularly significant because Poland engaged in prison reform very, very quickly after the collapse of communism, because a lot of their political leaders that emerged as political leaders in the 1990s had been political prisoners. Penal Reform International, Sweden. Incentives to support prison reform. Well, firstly, Kazakhstan's going through an economic crisis like most former Soviet Union countries in the 1990s, and so the prison estate is too big and it's hard to support economically. Also, there's a health crisis going on in the prisons, so this also becomes a reason not to keep people in prison. Prison officers themselves are worried for their own health, worried that they can get certain types of diseases, particularly tuberculosis, so it makes sense to try to reduce the prison population. Incentives in terms of performativity. Now, this is crucial, and this is a point I'll keep returning to. The prison rate is just a malleable measure to signal a change, to signal that we are changing something in the prison system. So instead of trying to change the qualitative elements of the prison system to make it a better system, to make it more humane, to reduce torture, to allow more civil society bodies in, we can just reduce the number of prisoners and flag it, advertise it as Kazakhstan is humanizing. Kazakhstan is not that nasty authoritarian country you think it is. In terms of opportunities, prison service officers remain militarized. So again, here we have a lack of reform. So today, still part of the Ministry of Interior. It's still a militarized organization. And so again, it just seems that the opportunity there is you prefer to change the number of prisoners rather than trying to completely adopt a new role for yourself, a new self-image for your institution. So you remain this militarized institution as part of the police. I'll talk about those issues in a little bit more detail. I'm going to specifically focus on the performativity element, and then this issue around the prison service and how it's remained part of the Ministry of Interior and remained militarized, and how that has sort of led to perverse incentives in terms of how the prison service operates. So prison rates and performativity. So what was basically seemed to be occurring was the executive, the presidential administration, was very sensitive to its image, particularly in terms of trying to get foreign direct investment into the country. You don't want big multinational companies don't want to come to Kazakhstan and then get wrapped up in scandals of abuse and torture. So this was an important way to use the prison rate to try to signal outside to the foreign direct investment community and also to the human rights community abroad that something was changing in Kazakhstan, and that pressure seemed to come from the presidential administration down onto the prison service. So this comes out in our interviews. So we have a former chairman of the Legal Policy Council in the presidential administration saying that the reforms themselves would come from the prison service, but the questions to be asked about how we punish in Kazakhstan would come from the top of the presidential administration, the president himself. We see a former prison service chief saying that a low prison rate will show the security of society, and this is crucial, the investment attractiveness of the state. We see a former deputy chief of the prison service in the late 1990s. He says that the government, the presidential administration, we wanted to decrease the prison population. And here he refers to the World Prison Brief. We were third in the world per 100,000, first America, second Russia, third Kazakhstan. It's a reputational issue, basically. So this is about performativity and about the way in which we use these ranking systems, right? So whether it's the World Bank governance indicators, Transparency International corruption barometer, perceptions index, whether it's the World Prison Brief, these things have impacts as they are then being perceived by policy actors, particularly in authoritarian regimes that want to, as some scholars call it, teach to the test, right? What's the easiest measure we can achieve in terms of showing that we're doing something, that we're changing, that we're reforming? In terms of just sticking with this idea of, so why would the prison service not resist prison downsizing? Well, here, we see that because they were part of the Ministry of Interior, this is very important. They're not allowed to be unionized. So they can't unionize and create collective action to resist. They're not allowed to join political parties as part of the Ministry of Interior. And their professional culture is subsumed by the Ministry of Interior culture, the militarized professional police identity, rather than the prison identity. So we have prison officers basically saying, it doesn't really matter to me whether I'm protecting a prison, and most prison officers are just doing the job of physical protection. Very few prison officers actually are inside the prison working with prisoners. Basically, they see their identity as being part of the police. So if you close a lot of prisons, you can just move me to a different type of job within the Ministry of Interior. I don't need to continue working with prisoners or with prisons. And this is summed up in one interview. So we have officers, firstly, who can move to a different office, department in the Ministry of Interior. It's not an issue. Others might take their pension, so there was no resistance from the prison service officers. And to show this, that basically the prison service was incentivized by a change in the prison rate rather than a qualitative change to how they did their jobs. I'll show now some data from a survey of prison officers, which I think suggests or indicates that prison officers very much didn't want to change how they did their jobs. They didn't want prisoners to be more empowered. They didn't want to change the qualitative aspects of their jobs. So the quantitative aspect was just the easy way to show that they were doing some change. So we have some data here. This is from a Kazakh scholar who did a survey of 213 prison officers in the Pavlodar region in northern Kazakhstan in 2009. This is exactly during these waves of decarceration. And as you can sort of see here, there are all sorts of questions about humanization. So should prison regimes be harshened for prisoners? Should they remove the death penalty? Do you support the removal of the death penalty? And you can basically see that all of the answers are incredibly punitive in terms of the officers' opinions. So prison regimes should be harshened, 91% say yes. Do you agree with the removal of the death penalty in Kazakhstan? There was a moratorium put on it. By this point, 80% say no. Do you agree with the statement that the use of parole should be limited? 71% say yes. But finally, when they're asked about should the number of prisoners in corrective facilities be further reduced, we can see it's an even split. We can see, of course, there's still that punitiveness there. They actually want to see more prisoners in prison, but it's not as clear cut as the rest of the questions. So the quantitative question about the number of prisoners is sort of ambiguous, ambivalent attitudes. The questions about the qualitative aspects of the prison regime, they want the prison regime to be harsh. So this speaks to that issue, basically, that we want to keep our jobs as they are, but if you want to have fewer prisoners, that's fine by us because we don't need to necessarily even work within the prison system to keep our jobs. Okay, so that's the sort of in-depth dive into what was going on with the prison system and the prison service and why the incentives, opportunities and norms that would lead them to support decarceration in Kazakhstan. But why is any of that interesting outside of people with a strange obsession with the prison service of Kazakhstan, like myself? So, in conclusion, I think that you can start to work up a theory here of authoritarian downsizing and thinking specifically about how prison rates, the World Prison Brief, works into performativity and how authoritarian leaders might be incentivized to look at manipulating quantitative prison rates as a mechanism of enhancing their reputation in certain communities. So this is where I want to go finally. Basically, I want to sort of try to suggest that we actually need a break here from Western criminological theory. This is why I think studying places like Kazakhstan actually can help us in terms of building theory. So we're not really talking here about popular punitiveness, for example. We're not really talking about political economic factors. We're talking about the power of presidential administrations to force particular types of policies on other institutions that are completely beholden to them, including the police, the prison systems, the judiciary, and so on. So really, unfortunately, and I'm sorry to put these pictures of these horrendous people on your screen, but this really is about the willpower of these particular people and they're then being convinced that penal downsizing could be beneficial to them in some way. So here we have Vladimir Putin, who has actually decarcerated since he became president very significantly. Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus. Belarus has also decarcerated very significantly since 2000. And Sultan Nazarbayev, our hero in Kazakhstan. So a theory of authoritarian penal downsizing, what might that look like? So here are some assumptions, which of course you can question, but these are the assumptions that I think you would start with to try and build this theory. So it's really all about the will of the presidential administration to push other institutions to enact mechanisms that produce penal downsizing. These assumptions are as follows. So authoritarian governments are interested in economic development and image manipulation. They are not interested in expanding political rights and freedoms. Authoritarian governments cannot challenge the security service status quo since they desire the loyalty of these services more than they desire their good governance. And this is very important, and political scientists have picked up this in terms of all sorts of spheres, which is the loyalty for discretion trade-off. So authoritarian leaders, they want the loyalty of the regimes. They need the police, and that includes the prison services, it's part of the police, to be loyal. In return, they have to allow them a certain amount of discretion, and that can include things like torture, use of violence, and a lack of civil society oversight. So these are the types of assumptions we have. If that's true, if those assumptions are true, then we might see an elective affinity for downsizing, so long as the penal downsizing saves money for the authoritarian leader. Downsizing can be used as a signal of the rule of law, so publicly advertising the World Prison Brief position and improvements, performativity again. And quantitative indicators can be improved at the cost of improvements in qualitative indicators, i.e. we can use the quantitative indicators and still maintain loyalty of the security services, preventing voice. And if downsizing only applies to common crimes, but not to political and economic crimes. So here's the big caveat about those big graphs, right, with the decarceration rates across the former Soviet Union. If you pick them apart, you'll see there are upticks, actually, there are increases in particular types of prisoner in places like Kazakhstan and Russia. So political prisoners, there's been a big uptick in Russia in the last couple of years. In Kazakhstan, we've seen a big increase in the number of people who are in prison for extremism. Now, extremism is understood very, very broadly, and that means anything that, you send a WhatsApp which is critical of the government and gets picked up. If you send a WhatsApp that's supportive of an opposition party or opposition leader, you can go to prison for extremism. So those types of things are expanding, right? So that, of course, makes sense as well. Downsizing can be used in this manipulative sense as long as no one digs into the data too deeply. And of course, the Will Prison Brief doesn't allow us that. Now, finally, just to say that this theory that what we're talking about here is penal policy, but there is a whole literature on authoritarian modernization, authoritarian reform, authoritarian policy making that looks at things like pension reforms, tax reforms, and we see these dilemmas playing out in the same way in those particular policy fields, just the same. So penal policy here is not particularly exceptional when trying to think up a theory, but it just seems that as criminologists, perhaps, that if we're trying to really think about what's going on in these particular jurisdictions, this sort of counterintuitive decline of the prison population in increasingly authoritarian regimes, actually needs theorizing. And often the tools that we have from the Western criminological literature, which is often very obsessed with the punitive turns of Western jurisdictions, or dogs that didn't bark, such as Canada, where you see these high risk factors, but we don't see penal upsizing, those tools don't really allow us a way of explaining this. So that's my pitch about why studying the prison service in Kazakhstan might be useful or interesting to people who are not interested in Kazakhstan. Thank you.